The 1045th and 1047th Regiments of Batiuk's 284th Rifle Division finally crossed the Volga overnight on the 21st to 22nd of September, and as part of Captain Kotov's 2nd Battalion of the 1047th Regiment was a certain ex-sailor who described what he saw that evening. A tugboat pulled up with a barge lashed behind it. The barge's hull had been heavily damaged by shrapnel. A sergeant was loading boxes into the hold, which was filling up with water. The boxes were full of canned meat from America. It was the second front after all. The sailors laughed at the sergeant. "What are you doing, Sarge? The second front is going to drown down there." The tugboat carried them across the Volga in the darkness, but as they reached the opposite bank of the river, a flare fired up overhead. They assumed the worst, but nothing happened. No machine guns, no artillery, nothing. They had made it across without a single casualty, much to the shock of the men themselves. "I still can't understand why the Germans did not fire a single round at us as we crossed the Volga. Perhaps it was because the night was exceptionally murky and we had been careful not to betray our presence with unnecessary sounds or movements. Perhaps they thought that we had given up sending in further reinforcements. More likely, the Germans simply let their guard down. Or it's because you crossed over to the Red October factory area, which was a way away from the German lines, so they wouldn't have seen you anyway, and if they had just randomly decided to shell the Volga, they would have been firing blind and basically wasting shells trying to hit boats that may or may not have been trying to cross the Volga at that particular time. And it's worth pointing this out because the crossings that were going on now weren't like the 13th Guards Rifle Division's crossings a week earlier. They weren't conducting D-Day style landings anymore. That's the reason why. Under air and artillery attack, the two new regiments of the 284th Rifle Division were moved south to the Dolgi Ravine area, where they joined elements of the 13th Guards Rifle Division in battle against German machine gun positions. But according to Zaitsev, as they passed the petrol storage tanks, German incendiary bombs hit the tanks, causing them to explode. The men were doused in burning petrol, and the survivors had to strip in order to survive. A bunch of naked Russian soldiers had come through their baptism of fire. It was unfortunate that they had to strip, because on the 22nd of September 1942, the weather got cold for the first time, with the morale of the troops, both inside and outside of Stalingrad, dropping with it. Soldiers began to write home about the impending doom of the Russian winter and how the nights were bitter already. Jason D. Mark, in his book Panzerkrieg, describes the situation for 103rd Panzer Battalion. The arrival of cold weather was a nasty shock. Shelters needed to be warmed, but the steppe provided nothing except sparse juniper bushes, so petrol was used for heating. The troops made ovens from metal containers with a shell casing as a stovepipe. There was some good news for the Germans though. Finally, on the 22nd of September 1942, the fighting at the grain elevator came to an end, as 29th Motorized Division smashed the final Soviet resistance and took 84 prisoners. Sixth Army's diary notes that 94th Infantry Division assisted in the operation, hoisting a flag above the building, and Hoffman had this to say about the incident. "We have broken the resistance of the Russians in the elevator building. We found about 40 corpses in the elevator. About half of them are sailors, sea devils they are. We took one prisoner. He is badly wounded and can't speak, or pretends he can't. Our battalion is now reduced to less than the ordinary complement of a company. None of our old soldiers can remember fighting as barbarous as this." Not all of the garrison surrendered though. A small group of 15 men, commanded by Polyakov, had broken out from the grain elevator via underground tunnels. They aimed for Bikitovka, because there were too many Germans to the north, and would reach friendly lines the next day. If Kozyanov's account is to be believed, then it's most likely that this was when he broke out too, not 2 days previously. Either way, with the elevator in German hands and with just 80 men left, Dubiansky and his division were now evacuated from the city and from the combat. They left 9,000 men behind in Stalingrad, all dead. Tarasov's 92nd Rifle Brigade continued to resist south of the Zaritsa, but it was on its last legs. After a heavy pounding by the Luftwaffe, the Germans attacked again. The commander of 2nd Battalion, Zakharov, was wounded whilst fighting for the Zaritsa. Worse, Tarasov's headquarters was located in this area too, and so his headquarters came under attack. Some reports indicate that the men of the 92nd Rifle Brigade may have fled in panic, some even across the Volga in boats and barges. But whatever happened, the Germans reached the central landing stage, destroyed 5 tugboats on the Volga, and compromised the ability of the Soviets to resupply their forces in the south and centre of the city. This had grim consequences for the 13th Guards Rifle Division. On 22nd of September 1942, the 13th Division faced a battle for its very survival. Our soldiers called it the Day of Death. We were all expecting to be drowned in the Volga. 71st Infantry Division put immense pressure on the Soviets in the centre of the city, and so intense was the fighting that the headquarters of 34th Guards Rifle Regiment, located in a sewer pipe, were surrounded at one point, and Panikin himself had to fight with his staff in order to hold on. One of the nearby battalions managed to break through to them, allowing them to withdraw from the railroad area to the 9th of January square. Then, elements of 295th Infantry Division retook the L-shaped house and the railway bureau. Parts of 2nd Battalion of the 42nd Guards Regiment were also surrounded as a result of this collapse in the 34th Regiment's lines, and they had to break out of their encirclement overnight. This building belongs to us, then it's theirs, then it's ours again. It's impossible to say exactly where the front lines are. We lacked any experience with urban warfare. Our weak point at the very beginning was our failure to grasp that the enemy had already occupied Stalingrad. We should have prepared ourselves better for urban warfare. We should have assigned specific streets and buildings to specific groups rather than task them with engaging some division along some line. The Germans were, at this time, in a stronger position. They had been quick to take the houses of specialists and the state bank, and they were still holding on to them. Our men were only 30 metres away, but no matter what I did, I just couldn't retake these buildings. Rodimtsev's own headquarters, located in another pipe in one of the Balkas, came under attack by the Germans. Previously, the German engineers had built a wooden dam and gathered a load of water behind it, hoping to flush out the Soviets from the Balka. It was just before 9 AM when suddenly there was a huge explosion. It was as if the ground beneath us had suddenly erupted. A huge torrent crashed through our HQ and we were immediately waist deep in surging water. I grabbed my maps, the guy in front of me lifted his typewriter, and we all waded towards the entrance. Rodimtsev led the way, holding his machine gun aloft. A telling statistic is that Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Rifle Division had entered Stalingrad with 9,500 men, and was now down to just 1,000 bayonets. They had probably lost around 4,000 men in 8 days of combat. Kobiakov also paints a grim picture for the 13th Guards Rifle Division. Several dozen men remained from the 34th Regiment. The guns of the 4th Destroyer Detachment were destroyed. Glantz comments, the remains of his regiments and battalions, often reduced to a handful of men each, were surrounded and, in one instance, buried alive by German fire. Although they weren't the only ones to suffer from that fate on this day. An aerial bomb broke into the earth bunker and collapsed the command post of the communication platoon which I was in. Of the 3 survivors buried alive, only I was blessed to see the light again. It's surprising that the Soviets were even able to bomb the enemy, considering that the Germans dominated the skies. Lieutenant Nikolai Kornachyonok, hero of the Soviet Union and one of the most experienced pilots the Soviets had in the Stalingrad area, was shot down and killed on this day. He was probably taken out by German fighter ace Hauptmann Wolf-Dietrich Wilkner, who claimed to have shot down 6 Yak-1s. 2 other German pilots reached their 100th air victories on this day too, and it's clear that the Red Army Air Force in the Stalingrad area was barely operational, and with the Germans doing so well in the air, it seems strange to some why the Sixth Army was going so slow. Noting on the 22nd of September that the army barely advanced, the self-righteous Richthofen accused it of constipation. It seems that Richthofen's words reached the Führer, and this may have had an impact on what happened on the 24th, which we'll discuss later in the episode. Back on the ground, Fedosiev's battalion continued to hold out in their southern pocket. Dragon's 40 or so men slowly fell back towards the Volga, but decided to take up position in a 3-story building, determined to make their last stand. They barricaded the windows and doors, broke down some of the internal walls on the top floor to create lumps of stone and beams to be thrown at the Germans, and placed their only heavy machine gun, with one belt of ammunition, on the lower floor. Difficult days began. Attack after attack broke unendingly like waves against us. This lasted 5 days and nights. Further north, German air and artillery strikes pounded the Soviets on Mamayev Kurgan. Then the 516th and 518th Regiments of 295th Infantry Division assaulted the hill once more. The Soviets opened up with mortars, artillery and rockets, and sent in counter-assaults. Despite this, the use of flamethrowers and assault guns helped the Germans inch forwards. The 112th Rifle Division was forced back to the railroad, and to stall the attack, the 284th Rifle Division's spare regiment was sent into action, losing 200 men in the process. In the Dolgi Balka, the forward elements of the 517th Infantry Regiment actually reached the Volga, and it looked like the 62nd Army would be split in two again. But the pressure of Batiuk's regiments to the north compelled the Germans to fall back from the Volga later in the day. With Batiuk's division heading into combat, this allowed Yermolkin to pull his exhausted men out of the line, and they moved north to reinforce the defences west of the Red October factory. I think it's worth just taking a quick look at the overall situation inside the city, starting from the bottom of the map. The Germans had now cleared most of the southern part of the city with just a small Soviet force holding out around the Tsaritsa. 13th Guards Rifle Division held onto a slither of land in the centre of the city, with the 284th Rifle Division reinforcing their north. There was a stalemate on Mamayev Kurgan, and not much had changed to the north of there. So, since the start of the city fight, it's fair to say that the Germans had secured most of the southern and centre of the city, but the north remained in Soviet hands. And overall, the Germans had probably taken maybe slightly less than half of the city by this time, so clearly there was a lot more fighting to go. And to the north of the city, the 2nd Kotluban Offensive ground on, with more bitter fighting for Hill 154.2. The Soviets didn't get very far, and the Germans knocked out several tanks in the area. It's clear that a change of tactics was needed, so in order to fulfill his previous order to shift his attack to the Kotluban Balka area, Moskalenko now formed 2 shock groups. The first shock group, deployed on the army's right wing, was to strike the boundary between the 76th Infantry Division's 203rd and 230th Regiments. The second shock group deployed on the army's left wing and was to assault the defences of 9th Machine Gun Battalion at 564th Station. Malinovsky would also join the offensive. 3 of his rifle divisions were given to the 24th Army, and he received Rodimtsev's 7th Tank Corps in their place, which prepared to attack the 16th Panzer Division at Herzovka. Both Malinovsky and Moskalenko were ready to begin the second phase of their offensive late on the 22nd of September. The question is, would the new plan actually work? Last time we spoke about the losses sustained on both sides. Today we're going to focus on one side, the German side, and reveal something a bit strange. In total, on the Eastern Front during July 1942, the Germans sustained 95,913 losses. In August, 158,162, and in September, 130,644. That's a total for those 3 months of 384,719 combat losses. A colossal amount, but how many replacements did they receive? Well, in July 1942, the Germans in the east received 177,800 replacements. Yes, more than their combat losses. In August, they received another 89,750, less than their combat losses, and another 83,750 in September. In total for those 3 months, they received 351,300 replacements, which is an overall loss of just 33,419 across the entire Eastern Front for these 3 months. And September was the first month where they were in deficit. In manpower terms, they were in surplus for the previous 2 months and only went negative in the month of September. The Germans weren't at full strength when Fallblau began, but the point is that their replacements were roughly keeping up with their losses. In fact, the deficit in September was the worst it would get. In October, they suffered another 68,175 casualties, bringing the total casualties to 452,894. But they received 97,200 replacements, bringing the total replacements to 448,500. So they were now just 4,394 men under where they had been in July. And in November, up until Operation Uranus, another 45,872 casualties were sustained for a total of 498,766, and they got another 61,200 replacements, which brings the total to 509,700. Overall then, by mid-November 1942, the Germans had made up all of their losses, and now had an extra 10,934 men than they previously had in July 1942. Let me just emphasise this. From July to mid-November 1942, the Germans replaced all of their losses on the Eastern Front. And yet this fact may come as a bit of a shock to many people, especially since we just learned last time how depleted the 6th Army was during mid-September. So what's going on here? How can the Germans have replaced their losses, yet the 6th Army be crying out for manpower? Well, let's break this down even further. In July 1942, there were 4 German army groups in the east. These were Army Groups North, Centre, B and A. In July, Army Group North sustained 14,767 casualties and received 35,200 replacements. That's a surplus of 20,433 men. Army Group Centre in July sustained 23,765 losses and received 71,600 replacements, a surplus of 47,835 men. Army Group A, the one in the Caucasus, suffered 26,554 casualties and received 51,600 replacements, a surplus of 25,046 men. But what about Army Group B, the one at the Don and at Stalingrad? Army Group B sustained 30,827 casualties in July 1942 and received 19,400 replacements. That's a loss of 11,427 men. They sustained 32% of the casualties on the Eastern Front, but only received 11% of the replacements. So, while the German manpower strength on the Eastern Front grew by an extra 81,887 men, Army Group B was down by 11,427. It was the only army group to be at a loss, and all the other army groups grew quite massively. Army Group Centre, for example, took 25% of the losses, but received 40% of the replacements. Let's look at August. Army Group North took another 25,508 casualties, bringing the total to 40,275 for July and August, and they received 22,000 replacements, bringing the total to 57,200 for the 2 months. Yes, they were down on the month, but they still had a surplus of 16,925 men for the 2 months. Army Group Centre took 70,655 casualties, a total of 94,420 for the 2 months, and received just 31,150 replacements. Again, they were down on the month, but the total number of replacements they had received so far was 102,750 men, which is a surplus of 8,330 for the July and August period. Army Group A took another 12,774 casualties for a total of 39,328 and received 23,600 replacements, totaling 75,200 for the 2 months. So their surplus grew to 35,872 men. And Army Group B, they took 49,225 casualties, a total of 80,052 for the 2 months, and received just 13,000 replacements, bringing the total replacements to 32,400, meaning that they now had a deficit of 47,652 men. Again, the only army group to be in a deficit at this time was Army Group B, and they were in a massive deficit. They had taken 31% of the casualties for this month and received just 14% of the replacements. September. Army Group North takes 37,824 casualties, a total of 78,099 for the 3 months. It received 20,400 replacements, a total of 77,600, meaning it was now in a deficit of 499 men. Army Group Centre took 27,889 men, totaling 122,309 for the 3 months, and received 30,200 replacements, totaling 132,950. Thus, it had grown its surplus to 10,641 men. Army Group A took 21,573 casualties, totaling 60,901, and received 13,150 replacements, totaling 88,350. Though down on the month, they were still in surplus for the 3 months by 27,449 men. And Army Group B, they took another 43,378 casualties, bringing the total to 123,430 for the 3 months, and received a whopping 20,000 replacements. 33% of the casualties, 24% of the replacements. That brings the total replacements to just 52,400, meaning that they had a deficit of 71,030 men for the 3 months. This is why Army Group B, and the 6th Army especially, was having so much trouble sustaining itself in the field. It was being neglected. Yes, Army Group North is in a slight deficit of 499 men, but that's not neglect. A deficit of 71,030 men is neglect. Why was Army Group B unable to take Stalingrad? Why was it struggling to hold on to the Don or stop the Soviets making bridgeheads across it? Why were they unable to race off to Astrakhan? It's because Army Group B was 71,030 men in deficit in September compared to July, and was the only army group to be anywhere near this depleted in terms of manpower. In other words, it had been neglected. Now, yes, the Germans were in deficit for the whole of the Eastern Front during September by 33,419 men. So the losses do have to go somewhere. But it seems unreasonable for more than double the total deficit to be sustained by just one army group on its own. Fundamentally, the widespread personnel shortages experienced by the German army late in 1942 were largely self-inflicted, the result of a series of official policies or lack thereof, rather than an actual lack of manpower. Yes, the lack of manpower, especially in Army Group B, but also across the entire Eastern Front, is self-inflicted, but the question is why? Why is this happening? Why aren't they more evenly distributing the replacements or replacing the casualties? The overall lack of manpower on the Eastern Front has to do with the Third Reich's centralised misallocation of labour, a scarce resource that has alternative uses, but that's a topic for another day. The main issue here is that they did send enough replacements to cover their losses, and yet, of the replacements they did send to the east, most of them went to the other army groups and didn't go to Army Group B. Why? It has not been possible to determine why Heeresgruppe B was afforded such a disproportionately low priority despite its importance to the final outcome of the summer campaign. But Liedtke, in his book Enduring the Whirlwind, offers some potential explanations, such as the need to replenish army groups north and centre, which had been neglected earlier in the year, or Hitler wanting these army groups to perform offensive operations, which they ultimately didn't. The schism between Hitler and Halder may have also played a role, and he also says, in their discussions with Hitler on 11th to 12th of September, Paulus and von Weichs were confident that Stalingrad would be taken by the end of the month. This in turn may have lessened the apparent urgency for their replenishment. I would like to point out that, as we've discussed previously, it was probably Halder and von Weichs, not necessarily Paulus, who were confident of victory during that meeting, but yes, this probably did have an impact on the reinforcements going to their formations. That said, Liedtke also explains that these reasons were probably tertiary reasons, and that the main reason was something else. After all, the allocation of replacements remained the purview of the organisational department of OKH, and Hitler's direct involvement appears to have been limited to periodic general instructions. Nonetheless, the skewed distribution of replacement personnel does indicate shockingly poor staff work, fault for which resides squarely upon the German General Staff and the various departments of OKH. Who was the Chief of Staff of the OKH again? You know, the guy responsible for the shockingly poor staff work of the OKH. And here's a question. Why would Hitler sack this guy? He's only doing a terrible job, so Hitler must have been a madman to get rid of him when he did, right? He replaced him with Zeitzler, who just wasn't as good, as the narrative usually says, even though Zeitzler started to undo the problems caused under Halder's watch. In October, Army Group North suffered 16,545 casualties, a total of 94,644 since July, and received 22,300 replacements, a total of 99,900. They were back in surplus at 5,256 men. Army Group Centre suffered just 11,965 casualties, a total of 134,274 since July, and 36,600 replacements. The total replacements was now 169,500, bringing the surplus to 35,276. Army Group A suffered another 17,740 casualties, 78,641 in total, and received 8,400 replacements, 96,750 total. So yes, it didn't cover its losses for the month, but was still in surplus by 18,109 since July. And finally, Army Group B took another 21,925 casualties, totaling 145,355, and received 29,900 replacements. That's the first time since July that Army Group B got more replacements than it had sustained losses, bringing its total replacements to 82,300. This meant that, again for the first time, that the deficit shrank, going to 63,055. Is this a coincidence? Halder gets replaced, and then suddenly the imbalances start to be corrected. Strange that, isn't it? November, up until Operation Uranus, is the same. 10,013 losses in Army Group North, totaling 104,657 since July, and 11,200 replacements. That's 111,100 total replacements, bringing the surplus to 6,443. Army Group Centre takes 12,136 casualties, totaling 146,410 since July, and gets 22,400 replacements. The total replacements now hits 191,950, making the surplus for Army Group Centre 45,450. Army Group A takes another 12,813 casualties, bringing the total to 91,454 since July, and only gets 9,400 replacements. Their total replacements, though, is 106,150, so they're still in surplus by 14,696 men. And Army Group B takes 10,910 losses, totaling 156,265, but gets 18,200 replacements, bringing the total to 100,500 replacements. The deficit for Army Group B is still there, but it's shrinking, and now is at 55,765. So, when Halder was in charge, Army Group B was neglected. When he is sacked, the damage done under his command was starting to be repaired. Obviously, there's more to this than just Halder and poor staff work. There was a recruitment issue, both Hitler and Speer were involved there, and there's another issue relating to this that I'm going to come back to talk about in the future, so don't complain that I didn't mention stuff, because yeah, I can't mention everything in a video as short as this. But the point for now is that the Germans had enough soldiers to replace their losses in Army Group B and the 6th Army, yet chose to send those replacements elsewhere for unknown reasons. Halder, as Chief of Staff of the OKH, is the guy who must take responsibility here. It was his job as Chief of Staff of the OKH to ensure that the staff work was being done correctly, and it clearly wasn't. And while it may just be a coincidence, it seems strange that when he got sacked, the manpower issue relating to Army Group B started to be corrected. Maybe this is all in hindsight, and maybe they didn't have the complete picture at the time, or maybe this was a deliberate act of sabotage, or just raw stupidity. I don't know, but whatever the reason, Halder and the OKH dropped the ball, and Paulus, and even von Weichs to some extent, can't be blamed for not winning the Battle of Stalingrad when they weren't getting anywhere near the replacements they needed. It should also make us wonder if the old narrative that Hitler poured thousands of men into Stalingrad only for them to die of attrition is correct. According to the numbers, the total opposite is what happened. At the strategic level, the Germans didn't feed troops into Stalingrad. Maybe they did at the local level with the odd division or two, but not in terms of manpower. And you'd think that if Hitler was so obsessed with Stalingrad that he would order Halder and Zeitzler to send more replacements to Paulus, and yet he didn't. Again, the old narrative comes into question, and it seems that something else was happening here that's largely been ignored. We'll come back to discuss this in the future. For now, let's see the struggle for Stalingrad continue. The 23rd of September 1942 was Paulus's 52nd birthday, and on his birthday, Hauptmann Hermann Graf shot down 4 Soviet aircraft in the morning, another 3 in the afternoon, and another 3 later on. That was 10 enemy aircraft shot down by a single German pilot in one day, and this brought his total kills to 197. But this had come at a cost. I had to take a rest. I just couldn't take any more. His wingman, Fulgraber, who had just reached his 50th victory, suffered a nervous breakdown and was grounded. Graf would be sent home shortly after getting his 202nd air kill later on the 26th, making him the first pilot ever to get over 200 kills. The 3 other aces who had just reached their 100th air kills in the previous days were also withdrawn from the fighting and sent back to Germany because of overall exhaustion. So, while the survivors racked up the kills, the number of casualties had slowly eaten away at the combat capabilities of the Luftwaffe, a factor which will come back to haunt them later on. Hartmann attacked once more, and this time Rodimtsev's division collapsed. They fell back away from the ferry landing area to where the State Bank was. 1st Battalion was still surrounded in their house near the nail factory, but even more isolated now, as other elements of 13th Guards fell back from the railway and the area north of 9th of January Square. As this was happening, the Germans at the Tsaritsa pushed the Soviets into an ever smaller pocket. Tarasov's 92nd Rifle Brigade continued to resist, but it was on its last legs. The commander of the 2nd Battalion had already been wounded on the previous day, and the 1st Battalion's commander, Captain Beroza, supposedly fled across the Volga with his wife, but was killed on the way. Having taken 2 clean pages of paper and a round official seal, Beroza left, together with his wife, for parts unknown. The question is, why would he have his wife with him? It's no wonder that Chuikov was also suspicious of this. 2 infantry brigades cut off from the army were fighting south of the river Tsaritsa. The only contact with the brigades was by radio. As from September 23rd, the reports from these brigades began to raise doubts in our minds. We felt that something was wrong. However, even though Chuikov was right to be suspicious of Tarasov at this time, it turns out that he wasn't actually lying. Igor Kobiakov has clarified the situation for us, and it turns out that Bereza really did flee with both his wife and the official seal, and that Bereza was shot on the 24th for desertion, and his wife spent the next 10 years in the labour camps. However, Chuikov was still right to be suspicious of Tarasov. Now, this is where the sources start conflicting with each other, so I'm not entirely certain of the timing here, and this may not have happened on the 23rd. Chuikov says the 23rd, but Isayev says the 25th, and Kobiakov says the 26th. However, regardless of the date, it appears that when Tarasov's headquarters came under attack, the commander packed up and left, crossing to Golodny Island on the Volga. Once there, he started submitting false reports to Chuikov detailing phantom actions that his brigade was supposedly undertaking in the city. So this move, which I'm just going to show happening now because it makes sense to do so after Chuikov's previous comment, left the remnants of the brigade and other units fighting with them without leadership at this critical moment. It had been a bad day for the Soviets in the south and centre of the city. However, this effort does seem to have exhausted the last of 71st Infantry Division's strength, as their infantry companies were down to just 10 to 15 men each by this point. So, the fact that they had managed to push Rodimtsev back just shows how exhausted his division was at this time as well. This is probably also why Chuikov ordered Batyuk's 284th Rifle Division to attack south across the Dolgi and Krutoy ravines, with some of Rodimtsev's forces in support. Chuikov needed to reinforce Rodimtsev to keep him in the line. In setting the division this task, I advised the commander, Batyuk, to bear in mind the experience of street fighting in small groups. Apparently, while still on the other side of the Volga, he had heard from our officers that new tactical methods were being worked out in the 62nd Army, and had ordered the commanders of regiments and battalions to study the experience of battle in the city, and soldiers to carry a double supply of ammunition and grenades. We'll come back to discuss the idea of the storm groups and the tactics Chuikov was coming up with in the future, but this is perhaps the first instance that a unit committed into Stalingrad had some time to prepare the men in such tactics prior to being thrown into battle. The other units had come up with the tactics on the fly by trial and error, with the raid on the State Bank being the first such use of the storm groups, and now they were being taught to other fresh units. It was early days yet, and these new tactics needed refining, but the consequences would soon become apparent. The fighting continued on Mamiev Kurgan as Chuikov ordered yet another attack on the hill, but the Soviets didn't get very far. After one German air attack, a company commander from the 95th Infantry Division was buried under debris for several hours. When he was dug out, he was presumed dead. But as they were about to bury him, a second blast from a bomb threw him several meters, causing him to regain consciousness, and back from the dead, he then continued to lead his company into battle. By this time though, Chuikov was also getting reports of the concentration of German forces at Mamayev-Kurgan. This was perhaps why Chuikov kept Popov's 23rd Tank Corps out of the action on this day, as it badly needed to both rest and refit. Popov only had about 1,000 men left and about 50 tanks, which simply wasn't enough to hold against the forces he now faced. Chuikov also sent engineers to create anti-tank obstacles and place mines in his sector, clearly expecting the German attack soon. North of the city, the second phase of the Second Kotluban Offensive began. Moskalenko's forces took a hill in the area and fought to capture 2 other hills later on. But under withering fire, the infantry lagged behind the tanks, which then were picked off by the German panzer and anti-tank elements. Thus, the Soviet attack achieved token successes at heavy losses and certainly didn't bring about the desired breakthrough. Worse, Malinovsky's 66th Army didn't attack at all as it should have done, so this second phase didn't get off to a good start. There was some good news though. Yet another Soviet division arrived in the area to reinforce Stalingrad. This was Smikitorov's 193rd Rifle Division. However, not all of the division arrived on this day. Most of it was at Leninsk, while its 685th Rifle Regiment had just reached the Volga at this time. Thus, only 2 battalions of this regiment began to cross overnight on the 23rd to the 24th of September to reinforce Chuikov inside the stricken city. And, of course, the 24th of September was about 10 days after the start of the fighting inside the city of Stalingrad. 10 days after Halder had announced that Stalingrad would fall in about 10 days, and yet the city still hadn't fallen. In fact, Paulus was under a lot of pressure to get on with it and finish the city. 71st Infantry Division therefore attacked, supported by a regiment from the 94th Infantry Division, some Stugs, and a battery of anti-aircraft guns used to fire on Soviet strongpoints. The 272nd NKVD Regiment's policemen, numbering about 220 men, fought desperately in the multi-storey stone buildings to the north of the Tsaritsa. But there was no front line, only the odd position held by small groups of militia and commissars. These couldn't hold on for very long, and the Germans slowly gained ground, pushing the Soviets further towards the Volga. At the intersection of Krasnoznamenskaya and Communist streets, there was a battle between 2 Stugs and a T-34. In fact, the aftermath of this engagement was captured in this photo here. The first Stug in the foreground was commanded by Karl Freundner, and the second on the left was commanded by Lieutenant Ulrich Kempel. In the distance, you can see the smoke from the burning T-34. And here is the T-34 that had been burning in the previous picture. The damage from a couple of ricochet shots is visible on the tank's frontal armour. As the Germans advanced, the headquarters of the 272nd NKVD Regiment was overrun. Be sure to check out Kobyakov's article on the City Garden, which goes into more detail about this action, link below. But reaching this apartment block by the mid-afternoon, Oberleutnant Holl, commander of 7th Company, 2nd Battalion, 276th Infantry Regiment, heard noises in the cellar below. He primed his grenade. I held a primed hand grenade, I kicked the door open and suddenly stood in the doorframe ready to throw the grenade and bring my submachine gun into firing position. The room was crammed full of people. Women holding children in their arms, old men, old women, boys and girls, all with their eyes staring at me, full of the fear of death. Everyone was crying and screaming in confusion. Several Soviet soldiers were hiding with the civilians, but they surrendered and were disarmed. Certainly a near miss, and by the end of the day, the U-shaped apartment building was in their hands, becoming the new front line. Fighting continued in the city centre and in the Dolgi ravine, with the Germans using flamethrowers and grenades to inch forwards by a few houses here or there. And at Mamayev-Kurgan, the 24th Panzer Division repulsed some minor Soviet probes. Then later, the 26th Panzer Grenadier Regiment was replaced by the 21st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, allowing the 26th to get some rest. Another attack penetrated their lines in the evening, but again was thrown back with the help of 40th Panzer Pioneer Battalion. Moskalenka's two shock groups did make better progress on the 24th of September. They actually managed to break through the Germans' forward defensive lines by the end of the day, capturing another hill and the 564th kilometer station again. A hail of artillery fire pounded the German lines, although this didn't stop them from retaking the hill that they lost earlier on. And Malinovsky's 66th Army finally began its assault. With 15,679 men in 2 divisions and with 82 tanks, they attacked the Azovka area. German forces were pushed back about a mile, but stopped the Soviets in their tracks by using artillery and mortars to once again separate the Soviet infantry from their tanks. Having isolated them, the Germans claimed to have knocked out 36 Soviet tanks in this area alone. But whatever the number, it was a slaughter for the Soviets. It should be obvious that there was now a stalemate at Stalingrad, and this could only be broken by additional reinforcements. Luckily for the Germans, the 100th Jaeger Division was now moving into the Stalingrad area. But just before it did, several officers of the Croatian regiment visited Paulus's headquarters, along with von Weich's. Then Ante Pavelic, head of the Croatian state, arrived. There was a meal and speeches, and Pavelic presented awards to his men and officers, as well as officers of the 6th Army. To Paulus he presented a large star-shaped medal, the Grand Order of the Crown of King Zvonimir, with stars and swords. In Jason D. Mark's book on the Croatian Legion, he provides numerous pictures of this occasion, so if you want to see several rare pictures of Paulus and Pavelic together, you should check it out. This is a spectacular book on the Croatian Legion, perhaps the definitive history of the regiment, but I want to highlight a very revealing quote from one of the German generals who was accompanying Pavelic at this time. They were a sun-bronzed lot, almost consistently of very fine physique. As was generally said when there was no Croatians around, the Croatian soldier was the best of all Hilfsvolk. After them came the Slovakians, then the Romanians, and so on. Jason D. Mark explains that the word Hilfsvolk means auxiliary people or auxiliary race, and implies they were a servant nation to the Germans. On the one hand, it shows that the Germans viewed the Croatians as decent troops, better than their other Axis allied partners, which is a compliment. However, on the other hand, it shows the contempt that the Germans had towards the Slavic peoples and other subservient races that they had in tow. Some may claim that the German army was the most diverse in history, but they are mistaken. There was no racial equality here. As this meeting was going on, much further west, the commander of the Romanian Third Army, Dumitrescu, wasn't impressed. His army was arriving on the Don front, but the area he had been assigned was clearly too wide. He complained to the OKH that he had just 69 battalions to defend a sector of 168 kilometers, that's 2.4 kilometers per battalion. Plus, the Germans and Italians had fallen back from the Don itself, with the Soviets forming 2 bridgeheads across the river. This meant that the Romanians weren't deployed along the river, a natural anti-tank obstacle, but on the open steppe. Worse, the Romanians lacked effective anti-tank weapons to halt any serious mechanized attack, meaning they were stretched way too thin, had too little equipment, and weren't in suitable terrain to do what was being asked of them. Dumitrescu therefore requested German support. He wanted them to help him recapture the ground south of the Don so he could form his line along the Don itself. This would give him half a chance of surviving in the event of a Soviet tank attack. But the Germans refused. They had already diverted their 2 reserve divisions, 100th Jaeger and 113th Infantry Divisions, towards Stalingrad, and they didn't have anything else to assist the Romanians with. From mid-September then, there were already massive problems on the Don flank, and they weren't getting fixed. And with the troops bogged down in both Stalingrad and the Caucasus, and with the hope of taking the oil fields slipping from his grasp, Hitler was not impressed. He moved to get rid of the poor reactionary general who didn't share his will for victory, and that leader was Franz Halder. After one last military briefing, Halder was relieved of his command as Chief of Staff of the OKH. After situation conference, farewell by the Führer. My nerves are worn out. Also, his nerves are no longer fresh. We must part. Necessity for educating the General Staff in fanatical faith in the idea. He is determined to enforce his will also into the army. Hitler had received the advice of both Schmundt and Göring, both of whom had been encouraging him to remove Halder and replace him with Major General Kurt Zeitzler. Well, on the 24th of September 1942, Hitler decided to call Zeitzler to his headquarters, where he was promoted to General of the Infantry and became the new Chief of Staff of the OKH. With Halder gone, the traditional and professional idea of the General Staff supposedly went with him. Halder had been the professional, Hitler the amateur. Hitler had made all the bad decisions, and Halder was frustrated with him, leading to Hitler dismissing Halder for not having the will to fight. With Halder gone, the General Staff now bowed to Hitler. However, I don't think this is what actually happened. Yes, the General Staff bowed to Hitler, but had done so previously anyway. Halder had been in Hitler's pocket for years. It was only the failures of the 1941 and 1942 campaigns that had led to his demise, and Halder had planned and led both those campaigns. Halder had agreed with Hitler on Führer Order No. 45, the order that the official German history pins squarely on Hitler and ignores Halder's involvement. Well, no. Halder was deeply involved in that order, and he also completely ignored the consequences. Despite claiming later to have been concerned about the Long Don flank, at no point in his diary does he give an indication of this concern. He mentions over and over how quiet that flank was. So in reality, Halder and Hitler had largely been in agreement. The issue really came down to the failure of Barbarossa and now the failure of Foul Blau. Hitler hadn't got the oil of the Caucasus, and more than 10 days after Halder had predicted that Stalingrad would fall in 10 days, Stalingrad hadn't fallen in 10 days. In fact, less than half the city was in their hands. Thus, rather than just being a madman, Hitler had plenty of reasons to be frustrated with Halder's poor leadership and awful staff work. His dismissal wasn't done randomly, and it wasn't a tragic event that proves how great the Wehrmacht officer corps was. No, Halder had failed. Halder needed to go, and Halder is gone, but sadly not forgotten. He would go on to distort the historical record and insert myths into the narrative of history that still plague the perception we have of the war to this day. So, let us remind ourselves who Halder was. Halder was the man instrumental in waging Hitler's wars of aggression, who wrote up the guidelines for the conduct of the troops in Russia, which talked about eliminating the resistance and the Jews. He drafted other orders too and led the armies that murdered and pillaged their way across Europe. He then denied everything, distorted the historical record, and got away with it. Worse, he was even praised for this. He became a historical icon in the West. Well, there will be no praise for him here. Goodbye, Halder, and good riddance. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.